Morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all from around the world. I'm Professor Sir Boyd, and I chair. And as chair of the Edinburgh Process for Subnational Local Governments on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, I'm delighted to welcome our distinguished speakers today, CBD parties and Edinburgh Process participants, to this Edinburgh Process webinar. It's for parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity. So good morning and good afternoon and good evening to you all. We're holding two webinars today to enable participation from across the globe. And this morning's session is specifically timed to allow colleagues from Asia and Pacific regions of the world to join us, and I welcome you all. Today I have the support of John Mowat and Sue Campbell from the Scottish Government, who will act as moderators for our session. Before we start today's programme, I would like to invite Sue to take us through a few housekeeping arrangements. So Sue, over to you.
Thank you, Sir Ian, and welcome everybody to this webinar. I'm sure everybody's familiar by now of the etiquette and arrangements for webinars, but for this particular webinar, I'd like to remind everybody that you should please, if you could, keep your video off and your microphone muted if you're not talking, and that'll help us with background noise and bandwidth issues. There will be an opportunity to ask some questions of our participants at the end of all of the presentations, so please do save your questions for then. We've set aside around half an hour for discussion. You can use the chat function to ask your questions, and the chair will invite those questions during the discussion session. During the discussion session, you can also use the raise the hand function, which can be found in the Zoom participants list. And John and I moderating will keep an eye on all of that. Please be aware that we are recording this webinar, and it will become available through YouTube with a link posted to the Scottish Government webinar page. And that's the page that was included in the CBD's notification for this webinar. And also, if you're an Edinburgh Process participant, you'll be able to find that video on our Attendify app. Our colleagues in Aichi Prefecture in Japan are managing a simultaneous GoToMeeting for translation into Japanese, and so that we can take questions from those of you in Japan. And I'd like to hand over to Togo Uchida, who is moderating on that side. Togo.
Yeah, thank you, Sue. For those of you who are Japanese, signed up for the GoToMeeting Japanese simultaneous version of this meeting, please send your questions to GoToMeeting chat box, and I will give that questions to the participants. So post your questions.
Virtual session number 1, posting to the GBF, and the other teams may use the documents there as a reference.
We seem to
I think there's a bit of a clash on.
So thank you, Togo. I think somebody has not put themselves on mute. So if you wouldn't mind to keep yourselves on mute, that would be helpful. Thanks. So thanks, Togo. Did you have anything else to add?
No, I'm okay. Thank you.
Okay, great stuff. So with that, we'll hand you back to Sir Ian, and we'll progress through the webinar. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sue, and thank you, Togo, very much indeed. So we've brought together a really great list of speakers today to address you, to highlight the Edinburgh Process outcomes and why parties of the CBD should take these on board. Unfortunately, none of the speakers are able to join us in person for this session. I think they're mostly at the later session, which is because of the timings. It's very early morning, middle of the night in many of their places. But we've sent interventions which we'll relay to you. First, we will have Rosanna Cunningham, the Scottish Government Cabinet Secretary for the Environment, on why the Scottish Government took a leadership role in this process and on the Edinburgh Declaration. Then we have Elizabeth Maruma Marema, the newly appointed CBD Executive Secretary, and her view on the role of subnational and local governments across the coming decade. And then we have Francis Agual, co-chair of the open-ended working group on the development on the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. Finally, we have Mayor Valérie Plante, Mayor of Montreal and ICLEI's Global Ambassador for Local Biodiversity, who's unfortunately not able to join us today, but has sent her message about the Edinburgh Process outcome delivered by Kobe Brand, the Global Director of ICLEI's City Biodiversity Centre. But we do have with us speakers from the Edinburgh Process organising team, Kobe Brand and Ingrid Coetzee from ICLEI, and Sue Campbell and John Mowat from Scottish Government will lead us through some of the more detailed results of the engagement with the subnational and local constituency and their ambitions for the post-2020 global biodiversity framework and its implications over the next decade. Can we move to the next slide? Thank you very much. The first aim was to gather the views of subnational and local governments on the development of the post-2020 framework and feed this back into the open-ended working group process and the CBD subsidiary bodies via an Edinburgh Process report. However, as well as feeding back through formal reporting processes, many of the over 400 Edinburgh Process participants also plan to raise the outcomes directly with their national focal points. The second aim is to review the CBD subnational plan of action, which was endorsed by the Conference of Parties in Nagoya, Aichi Prefecture, under Decision 1022 to consider what worked well, where improvements are needed, and how these can be taken forward at COP15 in Kunming. And thirdly, we want to develop the Edinburgh Declaration, a high-level political declaration outlining subnational and local governments' ambitions for the post-2020 framework and setting out what they can contribute. Whilst the Scottish Government has been leading this process over the last year, it is safe to say that it would not have happened without the tireless support and really wonderful partnership of all the organisations seen here, from global subnational networks and organisations to national and regional governments and agencies that work on the ground delivering for nature. Without this partnership, the Edinburgh Process could not have been delivered. So we take this opportunity to thank all our partners in delivering the Edinburgh Process for the convention. I'd now like to invite John Mowat to play the message from our first keynote speaker, Rosanna Cunningham, the Cabinet Secretary for Environment, Climate and Land Reform from the Scottish Government. John, over to you. Or Rosanna, over to you.
I'm delighted to be speaking to you all today. Scotland was one of the first countries to declare a global climate emergency and to recognise the links between climate change and biodiversity loss. We were the first country to submit a full progress report against the groundbreaking international targets agreed at Aichi, Japan in 2010. I'm really pleased to acknowledge the continuing contribution of Aichi Prefecture in assisting with the development of the Edinburgh Process. Subnational governments play a key role in delivering action to address the dual challenges of climate change and biodiversity loss. Scotland has set world-leading climate change targets, and our largest city, Glasgow, of course, will host the Climate Change Conference COP26 next year. I was keen that we also adopt a leadership role on biodiversity as well. That is why when the CBD asked if we would consider hosting a workshop on the contribution of subnational, regional and local governments, I jumped at the chance. We have been delighted to lead that engagement as part of the important process to develop the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework to be agreed at COP15 next May. Parties to the convention formally agree the global framework and targets for biodiversity, but all levels of government, particularly where responsibilities are devolved, as is the case for Scotland, have a central role to play to deliver transformative actions for nature across the coming decade. And that is why the Edinburgh Process is so important to ensuring that the voices and views of the subnational constituency are heard and taken into account at every stage of developing the goals, action, targets and monitoring framework to be adopted in Kunming. I am grateful to the CBD for their willingness to engage the subnational constituency and to our global partners for their partnership in developing the Edinburgh Process. And through that process, we have established a new international agreement, the Edinburgh Declaration, which sets out the aims, aspirations and expectations of subnational and local authorities. It celebrates the progress and commitment that has already been shown and the strong desire to build upon previous relevant decisions endorsed by the Convention. All levels of government, including cities, have a key role in translating global and national strategies into real and tangible local actions. Often, the resources to put in place transformative actions for nature, the money, people and infrastructure, are directed at these levels of government. And this may not always be recognised nor properly utilised by central governments. Our consultation shows that 60% of devolved parliaments, local authorities, city governments, etc. are not engaged by their central government counterparts when it comes to planning and reporting on biodiversity. If the current global pandemic has shown us anything, it has shown us just how important nature is to the health and well-being of every single person on the planet. We must work together at all levels of government and reach out to the voluntary and private sectors to ensure a green recovery from COVID-19. In Scotland, we are also guided by just transition principles, making sure that our green recovery is fair and that nobody is left behind. And that is another reason why we're taking up leadership on nature and on climate change. A strong post-2020 global biodiversity framework is one that recognises and includes all levels of government and administration in planning, mainstreaming, communicating and raising awareness, in providing finances and building capacity for implementation, and in enabling knowledge exchange and sharing best practice. We can put in place actions that deliver against multiple outcomes and work across multilateral environmental agreements to bring positive benefits, for example, to nature, people's health and well-being, and climate change, whilst addressing the Sustainable Development Goals. The Edinburgh Declaration is our call to central government counterparts to take stronger actions and make bolder decisions across the coming decade. The Declaration is now open for signing by all levels of government and non-governmental supporters, and indeed by supportive state parties. It would be remiss of them if they did not grasp this opportunity to recognise their vital role in meeting national targets for biodiversity. The good news from our consultations is that the vast majority of non-central government participants are ready and willing to be involved. I would urge you to reach out and fully engage with your colleagues. This is how we can realise the Convention's vision for this planet of living in harmony with nature. So from Scotland, thank you.
And thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. I think that underlines the commitment of Scotland to the CBD. the Edinburgh Declaration is indeed an excellent and very important initiative for subnational and local constituency ahead of COP15 next year. It's available on the Scottish Government website. The link will be shown at the end of this webinar. The moderators can also add it into the chat box if necessary. And by the way, thank you very much to those of you who have put messages in the chat box this morning, messages of welcome and thanks. So thank you very much for those. If participants have any questions on the declaration, or indeed anything that Ms. Cunning has said in her message, please do ask those at the later discussion session, where John, Sue and others from the Scottish Government who are joining us today will be able to address those questions. The other thing is that translations of the declaration are currently available in Spanish, French and Portuguese. Russian, Arabic, German, Chinese and Japanese translations are in preparation. Please keep an eye out for these on the declaration webpage in due course. Now, let's move on to our next honoured speaker. The next message we have is from the Executive Secretary of the CBD, Elizabeth Marima. I appreciate that this is an extremely busy time for the CBD, and I'm grateful to Ms. Marima for sending this intervention, which our moderators will now play. Thank you, John.
Distinguished delegates, colleagues, greetings. I regret that I could not join you today, but would like to take this opportunity to join the Scottish Government in welcoming you to this webinar. This webinar is the outcome of the Edinburgh Process on the role of subnational, regional, and local governments in the preparations and implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. I would like to start by congratulating the numerous organizations that contributed to the success of this consultative process that was originally to have been convened as a standalone workshop in April. Owing to the coronavirus pandemic, that was not possible. Undoubted, however, the partners in this initiative devised an alternative approach using a series of virtual and online consultations held over many weeks, and to the excellent effect, probably surpassing what would have been achieved in the face-to-face workshop. The steps that we will collectively take in the coming months and years will be crucial. Subnational governments, cities, and other local authorities have an important role to play, not only in the development of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, but also, and importantly, in its implementation. With the current climate, health, and biodiversity crisis, and as demonstrated in the findings of the 5th edition of the Global Biodiversity Outlook, we know that it is not possible to wait before making transformative changes. We all have to join forces now, urgently, in a whole of society approach. Actors at the subnational levels understand that efficient action for biodiversity requires involvement of all stakeholders, including indigenous peoples and local communities, the youth, women, businesses, and other groups of civil society. They also understand the importance of the vertical integration of planning, policies, and actions for biodiversity through all levels of government. It is my wish to see parties to the convention and other stakeholders continue to engage with subnational governments, cities, and other local authorities. For they are not only enablers of implementation, but also dynamic actors on the ground who can contribute to mainstreaming, monitoring, reporting, mobilizing resources, education, and awareness raising, to name a few of their fields of their responsibilities and expertise. I would like to thank again the Scottish Government and all partners in the Edinburgh process for leading this important consultation and for joining forces on the road towards the 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature. Once again, congratulations for this success of this initiative. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Executive Secretary, for your message. It clearly set out the strengths of subnational and local governments in delivering for nature and the role that they can play right across the post-2020 framework, from planning through to implementation and monitoring and reporting. I agree completely with you, by the way, about the way that this has been an extremely inclusive process. There are not many good things that have come from COVID-19, but one is to teach us a way to be very inclusive using these kind of modern communication methods. And I think that's been a huge advantage in this process. The CBD have done a lot of work over recent years to include the subnational constituency in their consultations. For example, on long-term approaches to mainstreaming, on capacity building, and on resource mobilization. And it's very clear from this message from the Executive Secretary that CBD values the contribution the subnational constituency has made to this and can build upon through the next framework. I'd just like to move on now. So we next have Mr. Francis Ogoal, whom you may know is one of the co-chairs of the open-ended working group, along with Basil van Haver. The co-chairs have the unenviable job of developing the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, and they have both been active in participating in our Edinburgh Process information webinars. They've been providing updates and information for the subnational and local constituencies on the development of the global biodiversity framework and on the shifting timetables. Francis will continue in that vein here. So John, could you play the message from Francis?
Hello, my name is Francis Ogoal of Uganda. Along with Basil van Haver, we are the co-chairs of the open-ended working group for the development of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. First and foremost, I would like to congratulate you on the launch of the Edinburgh Declaration. It has been a long journey, but the results are inspiring and hopefully will catalyze stronger ambition throughout the world. The post-2020 global biodiversity framework will be implemented at the national, subnational, and local government levels because much of the on-ground activities will take place at that level. The support of subnational and local governments is thus fundamental for the successful implementation of the post-2020 framework. The commitments outlined in the Edinburgh Declaration signals that our continued engagement is vital to meet the 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature. Although there has been progress in the implementation of the Aichi biodiversity targets, the recent findings in the GBO file show that taking action now and in the future is crucial. While the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework process has been delayed, this has not stopped us. We have continued to work hard to gather advice from partners and stakeholders, to listen to each other, so we can grow our own collective expertise and knowledge base. We are engaging parties, regions, stakeholders, and the public to keep momentum going. Being engaged throughout the Edinburgh process has been enlightening to us and has helped us better understand the ongoing concerns and priorities of the subnational and local governments. We truly value that we were part of your dialogues. These uncertain times call for flexibility and adaptability. COVID has set unprecedented change in the way we do things at the CBD. We have had to adapt, readapt, and we likely need to keep adapting. Now that the Edinburgh Declaration has been agreed, this will undoubtedly create a bit of stability and underpin the negotiations. Moving forward, we are determined to deliver a successful global biodiversity framework with subnational and local governments alongside with us. Only together, we can set a path to meet the 2050 vision of biodiversity where we live in harmony with nature. To meet this vision for biodiversity, negotiations between 196 parties of the CBD are on track, and your input to those country positions is critical in the development and implementation of an ambitious post-2020 biodiversity agenda. Basil and I wish your declaration resonates widely. The results of your extensive collaboration and engagements are truly the heart of the entire post-2020 process. We are inspired by you and know that your efforts will not go unnoticed. The Edinburgh Declaration is one of the first steps that will amplify a global message that captures our collective effort to live in harmony with nature by 2050. Thank you.
So I'm so grateful to Francis and actually to Basil, because Basil has been a co-worker in this, for that supportive message on the work of the Edinburgh Process. It's very relevant to the subnational and local constituency in implementing the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, and with support of for the Edinburgh Declaration in the run-up COP15. So thank you very much indeed. And I'd like to thank Francis for taking time out of his very busy schedule to support this webinar and in speaking to you all today. I'd like to now move on to our final keynote speaker for today, which is Mayor Valerie Plante, the Mayor of Montreal City, Canada, and the ICLEI Global Ambassador for Local Biodiversity. Unfortunately, Mayor Plante is not able to join this early session of the webinar and is disappointed that she cannot join this session. However, Kobe Brand, who is the Global Director of ICLEI Cities Biodiversity Centre, will read out the intervention for Mayor Plante. So Kobe, are you able to go ahead?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. And it's my big honor to deliver this message on behalf of Mayor Valerie Plante. Chair, Honorable Cabinet Secretary, distinguished delegates, it is a great pleasure that I address you today as ICLEI Global Ambassador for Local Biodiversity. ICLEI and its Global ICLEI Cities Biodiversity Centre, the CBC, has a proud history of advocacy in the global biodiversity agenda. We have represented the voice of cities and local governments for more than a decade in the CBD and related processes. During this time, the main vehicle for advocating the voice of our constituency has been the successive global biodiversity summits of local and subnational governments held since CBD COP9 in 2008. These summits were held as official events in parallel to the CBD COPs and have been co-convened by ICLEI, the SCBD, the host governments, and in the recent summits also our key network partners. Each summit resulted in a declaration which was presented to CBD parties during the plenary session. The 7th summit will be held at Kunming as official parallel event to COP15. Over the past decades, we have also seen the CBD parties respond to the voice of our constituency with the adoption of decisions related to local and subnational governments. Together with our network partners, the European Committee of Regions, the Advisory Committee on Subnational Governments, coordinated by Regions for Sustainable Development and the Government of Quebec, and the group of leading subnational governments towards Aichi biodiversity targets, ICLEI committed at COP14 to respond to the call made in Decision 1434 on the participatory process for the preparation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. This commitment was captured in the Sharm el-Sheikh Communiqué for Local and Subnational Action for Nature and People, adopted by local and subnational governments, our networks, and our partners at the 6th Global Biodiversity Summit of Local and Subnational Governments held at COP14. Following COP14, we developed a roadmap and embarked on a series of events, webinars, and awareness raising and information sharing events, and online opportunities for our constituency. This included our series of monthly webinars hosted by ICLEI CBC and physical events co-hosted by local and subnational governments, ICLEI, our network partners, and the CBD. The Edinburgh Process has been a highlight in our roadmap. ICLEI is proud to be associated with this process as a partner and a signatory to the Edinburgh Declaration. ICLEI is convening a high-level political session at our Daring Cities 2020 that will focus specifically on our constituency's ambitions for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Daring Cities 2020 is a virtual global forum on climate change for urban leaders tackling the climate emergency, especially in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, and will run from 7 to 28 October 2020. The climate and biodiversity crises are two sides of the same coin, and local and subnational governments are critical to solving both. For this reason, the high-level session will challenge cities to be daring enough to not only make ambitious commitments to achieving the global climate agenda, but also to achieving the global biodiversity agenda. We will be daring cities to sign the Edinburgh Declaration. Thank you, and we look forward to continued engagement with CBD parties on the path to COP15.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Mayor Plant for her message to this webinar, and particularly to you, Kobe, for delivering it so eloquently. It's very, very much appreciated. Thank you very much indeed. I believe that Ingrid Coetzee will be able to address any questions arising from Mayor Plant's intervention at our later discussion. So please do, if you have any questions, address them to Ingrid. So now I'd like to hand over to the Edinburgh Process team, who have, by the way, done an absolutely wonderful job to get us to this stage, who will take us through the Edinburgh Process outcomes in a bit more detail. So John, I think, is going to lead on this, but I'm never quite sure. There's a real partnership here between John and Sue of the Scottish Government. So they'll begin, and then Kobe and Ingrid, I think, from ICLEI are going to follow. So, John, I think it's you who are going to take this up.
Yes, thank you, Surrey, and yes, it will be me for this session. So now we'd like to take you through the Edinburgh Process outcomes in a bit more detail. And normally at this stage in the presentation, I would have shown everybody a picture of the Edinburgh Process partners and our subnational and local government colleagues huddled over a table in a breakout group, working hard to develop the Edinburgh Declaration. But of course, it's not been a normal year, and we haven't been huddled around tables, at least not physically. Maybe virtually, we've been huddled around tables. And as Sarian already said, that disruption and challenges caused by COVID have actually allowed us to develop a more inclusive, equitable process and to reach a wider number of participants, at the same time as probably vastly reducing our CO2 emissions and impact on the planet, whilst achieving, we could say, arguably a greater outcome in terms of the Edinburgh Process. And I think that's a lesson that we can take from this process, as we still struggle with the ongoing pandemic, is that we can make transformative change and we can adapt quickly. We just need the will to do it. So for those of you who are maybe less familiar with the Edinburgh Process, it has been taken forward through a series of online information events, webinar discussions on specific themes, as well as online meetings. And through 3 consultations covering the global biodiversity framework, a renewed plan of action, and then of course on the Edinburgh Declaration itself, which sets out our ambitions for COP15 going forward. We have just over 400 participants registered in the Edinburgh Process, mainly from subnational, local and city authorities, but including academics, non-government organisations, business, and including young people, women and local communities. So we've taken all these views on board in our input to the Edinburgh Declaration, which was published on the 31st of August. In this part of the webinar, we'll set out some of the key results from our consultations, which show the importance of subnational local governments in delivering the post-2020 framework over the next decade, and why we're calling for a dedicated decision for subnational local governments at COP15, and why this should be supported by parties. So at the start of the process, to support contributions to our consultations, we ran a series of themed sessions which covered topics that were important to subnational and local governments and their implementation of the future framework. So I'll just quickly run through some of the key outcomes from the session on monitoring and reporting tools. It was clear that in order to comprehensively monitor the post-2020 framework, that the framework must enable vertical integration and implementation at all levels through monitoring, that there was a strong willingness of subnational local governments to contribute, and that the post-2020 framework should be explicit on the role of subnational governments when it comes to monitoring and reporting. In terms of the linkages between climate change and biodiversity, it was clear that subnational and local governments are contributing to a bottom-up approach towards the convergence of these two agendas. There are strong subnational and local networks already sharing best practice in these fields, and subnational and local governments face diverse realities, especially on growing land use conflicts, which need to be taken into account by the international community. It's crucial that states implement and highlight coordinated climate and biodiversity approaches and explore multi-level interactions to help delineate clearer roles for each governance level. And it's important that subnational governments are better integrated into the implementation process. On nature-based solutions, the subnational constituency plays a leading role in delivering nature-based solutions by adopting adequate legislation locally, providing guidance and implementation at the landscape and local scales, and providing financial and technical support within the jurisdictions. A convergence of the biodiversity agenda with the other international agendas, e.g. the Sustainable Development Goals and the climate agenda, would strengthen the position and importance of both the biodiversity agenda and nature-based solutions as a means to simultaneously address multiple challenges. The current COVID-19 crisis powerfully demonstrates the role of nature-based solutions for human health and well-being. Subnational local governments fostering the importance of nature-based solutions for the quality of life and human health will help build support needed for their implementation. In terms of resource mobilisation, subnational local governments are on the front line in taking action on biodiversity. This requires investments at all levels, including at the subnational and national, a significant portion of which needs to be implemented at the subnational and local scale. While some finance opportunities exist, such opportunities are often not enough to meet the investment needs, especially after the COVID-19 pandemic. National governments should support subnational and local governments in leveraging finance from additional sources such as the private sector. And finally, the post-20 framework must improve the readiness of and capability of subnational local governments to access and harness financial resources in support of its implementation. When we consulted on the zero draft of the framework itself, there was a high consensus in the responses that the key biodiversity issues for subnational local governments were covered. However, there was a concern about the lack of reference to subnational authorities and a lack of emphasis on virtual integration of the different levels of government, despite the welcome reference to the whole of government approach in the zero draft. This is particularly important when in some regions 70% of biodiversity legislation is being implemented at the subnational and local level. One of the key messages was that subnational local governments should not be considered just as another stakeholder, but that their competency in implementing the framework should be recognised. So we're pleased to see the strengthened text within the next version of the zero draft of the framework. However, there are more areas where links could be more explicit. A recurring theme in the consultation was a wish to see a clearer link between the drivers outlined in the IPBES Global Assessment, both direct and indirect, and the goals and targets in the framework. Also, subnational and local governments are in many cases uniquely placed to implement the framework through mainstreaming and nature-based solutions due to their closer links to stakeholders, including businesses, NGOs, and local communities and Indigenous peoples. However, they felt that the targets on mainstreaming tended to be too process-driven rather than focus on ecological outcomes. Whilst the new framework is very much welcomed by the constituency, many commented that the need to keep the number of goals and targets limited, whilst placing a greater emphasis on meeting people's needs through sustainable use and benefit sharing, resulted in the zero draft losing specificity for a number of sector-based targets. This was particularly the case for fisheries, where the lack of a specific reference, as there is for agriculture, will mean that political hooks are missing to address this sector. The respondents welcomed the stronger link between biodiversity and climate change, however felt that there should be a stronger focus on protecting carbon stores and nature-based solutions. This was clearly highlighted in the two Edinburgh Process webinars that I've just outlined on climate biodiversity and nature-based solutions. Most respondents felt that the overall ambition of the framework was towards what is needed to set us on the road to recovery. However, caveated this with it will much depend on how the final negotiations play out as we lead up to COP15. And respondents noted that there should be a stronger focus on restoration, particularly as the next decade is the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration. The impacts of COVID-19 pandemic, the lockdown restrictions and resulting economic recession have not been shared equally across society. Similarly, the impacts of climate change and the loss of nature will not be borne equally by all. And participants highlighted that interventions that will benefit sectors of society most heavily impacted by climate and nature emergency in the pandemic, for example, improving access to nature, should be prioritised. We were pleased to see the improvements to the monitoring framework following the peer review. However, consideration needs to be given to the inclusion of indicators that can be used at all levels, including the subnational and local level, There's also need to have elements or indicators for the participation of subnational local governments in implementation, such as the adoption of local biodiversity strategies and action plans and the adoption of nature-based solutions. Greater emphasis also needs to be given to the role that subnational governments play in implementing the framework across all aspects. We'd like to see this strengthened in the final document. Importantly, feedback has shown that despite being willing to contribute, the majority of subnational local governments are not directly involved in planning or reporting against CBD commitments. This is a large gap which needs to be addressed if we are really to do things differently in the next decade. And the next two slides will illustrate that point. When we asked people to respond to the consultation, we asked them how they had been engaged in developing the post-2020 framework. And only 14% of respondents highlighted that they were directly engaged through their national focal point on the development of the framework. And whilst around 30% of respondents were actively engaged with the national focal points on planning and reporting, there are still many subnational governments who would like to take an active part, with an additional 56% of our respondents for planning and an additional 68% willing to participate in national reporting. This is an important point to emphasise, as in the new zero draft of the framework, there is still a need for vertical integration in relation to planning and reporting. It still only specifically actions national government entities and does not address subnational local level, which is a missed opportunity and leaves an untapped resource. It's also critical to capture the collective actions of subnational governments, cities and local authorities in reporting and measuring the overall implementation of the framework. These are not currently being fully captured in assessments such as the 5th Biodiversity Outlook. This lack of integration between national and subnational levels is a real gap which needs to be addressed in the post-2020 framework through tangible actions taken at those levels in the coming decade. And I'll now hand over to Ingrid to take you through some of the outcomes of the Subnational Plan of Action consultation.
Thank you very much, John. And I'll jump straight in. I'm looking forward towards COP15 and beyond in my presentation. One of the main objectives of the Edinburgh Process consultation was also to take a look back and to review the Plan of Action on subnational governments, cities and local authorities that had been adopted under Decision 1022 from the local and subnational government perspective. And then secondly, to get some feedback from our constituency on what it was that we would be looking for from the parties around ensuring a greater role for local and subnational governments in a renewed, dedicated and more ambitious decision to be adopted at COP15. And if you can move to the next slide, please, John. I think the important thing is that when we talk about the impact or the feedback that we got from the Edinburgh Process, it's also good to see what the breakdown of the attendance was. And you'll see that very obviously there was a large contingency from our constituency, but it was also quite diverse and representative of other groups. And the importance of this is that it shows that the cumulative analysis of responses that we got through the process can be taken as a very well representative voice of local and subnational governments. And you can take me to the next slide, please, John. What we looked at in terms of the outcomes from the Plan of Action review is that if we look back over the past 10 years, there's a very strong, compelling case to renew this decision because there's been a lot of achievements, not just at national government level, but certainly also at the level of cities, local authorities and subnational governments. And this highlighted that there's a strong level of understanding of the Plan of Action amongst our constituency. The majority of respondents had either dealt with the Plan of Action, they were very familiar with it, they used it as an informant, but many of them also gave us cited examples of what they had actually done as a result, either directly or indirectly, of Decision 1022. So we see that as a result of the past decades of involvement and actions, our constituency of local and subnational governments are ready to continue contributing and supporting the CBD parties in implementing the new framework that we will be adopting at COP15. And the Edinburgh process is significant as it provides this mandate for us. And coming out of the discussions and consultations, we identified various principles for subnational contributions going forward. And these are on the screen there. I think what I'm going to do now, John, if you can take me to the next slide, I'd rather spend a bit more time on what those principles mean, what the significance of those principles are. These are essentially principles that will form the basis of what we would like to recommend that the CBD parties consider for adoption at the COP15 as a renewed dedicated decision. And I think the most important one, or first and foremost, is the recognition that subnational and local governments are integral to government with jurisdictional powers and functions. They have the competencies and responsibilities to take action and make decisions, and they are accountable implementers. They're not merely just stakeholders. The second point that I would like to make is that the role of subnational and local governments in mainstreaming biodiversity is absolutely vital, and it needs recognition and support, and we are happy to see that this certainly is something that's being recognized through the work of the Informal Advisory Group on Biodiversity Mainstreaming. And linked to this is the issue around vertical integration in NBSAPs particularly, but also other areas. It's very important that this is something that is taken up and embedded in all levels of government, particularly the subnational levels of government. And also it links to the issue of reporting, because if we capture in the reports that are made to the CBD, what is happening at the local and subnational levels in implementing the new framework, we'll get a much better and bigger picture of the actual physical impact on the ground. Something else that is important, and you'll see that we've talked there about capacity building, resources, etc., is the fact that at the subnational and local levels, we do need support from our national governments to build capacity. Yes, subnational levels of government can mobilize resources, but there are also instances where we do need support in accessing resources and being able to access the enabling regulatory environments to access resources further. And I think the other thing that's important, and that's the last bullet, is that there are networks, and we've proven through this Edinburgh process and a lot of the advocacy work that's done by our network organizations is that they do have a role to play, and they can continue to support governments in this field. And if you can take me to the next slide, which is my final slide, just in terms of the picture looking forward from the local and subnational government constituency, there's three main things that I would like us to just focus on. The first is that we need to raise our ambition when it comes to implementing biodiversity actions at the local and subnational levels. And we feel that we can do this through a stepped up and renewed dedicated decision. We also need the willingness and support of the CBD parties and state actors to work with us, to better communicate with us, and to draw upon our resources, the infrastructure, the knowledge, the people, and the financial resources that are already in place. We know that there's more to do, we admit this, and that we can do better when we work together. And that was why we've drawn up the Edinburgh Declaration, and we are encouraging cities and subnational governments to sign this. And we are seeking a dedicated decision for the greater inclusion of our constituency within the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Sue, yes, Sue, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Ingrid, for setting out all of that. That's and John.
Sue, I think your
outcomes
internet.
And it's, as we said, it's published and available for signing.
Sorry, Sue, I think your connection is a bit is playing up a bit. I don't know. Do you want to hand over to John, or do you want to try and persevere?
No, hand over to John.
Okay, John, sorry about this.
Yeah, sorry, Sue. Yes, as the Cabinet Secretary outlined the aims and purposes of the declaration earlier in the webinar, and it's now published on and available on for signing on the Scottish Government website. We've just highlighted, we put in the link at the end of the presentation, but you can just also search for Edinburgh Declaration Biodiversity and should get there. The declaration highlights the commitments of subnational and local governments, and we've placed on screen here the 4 key asks of CBD parties as they negotiate the new framework. And the declaration will also be presented, hopefully with a long list of subnational local government signatories at the 7th Global Biodiversity Summit of local and subnational government and at COP15. As mentioned previously, we'll make this available in other languages, so please keep your eye out for that. But I think it's just important to take on board these 4 key messages that we want to present to parties leading up to the discussions at COP. And just to summarise the outcomes of the Edinburgh process, we've highlighted some of them already through the presentation that are available, will be available now, such as the declaration, or very shortly, such as the Edinburgh process report and the plan of action or draft decision. We've also got future events coming up in terms of hopefully a side event or side events at the subsidiary body and implementation whenever that's held. And then at the 7th Summit and at COP. Now, so if I can now hand back to you, Sirian.
Yeah, thank you, John and Sue. I know you tried, Sue, but these technical things come to try us on occasions. So the last remaining question is, why should you, as CBD parties, act on the outcomes of the Edinburgh process as you negotiate the post-2020 framework and move forward with implementation of that framework? Well, this slide actually details, I think, why you should do that. We want to achieve transformative change. We truly need a whole government society approach. In line with principle 2 of the ecosystem approach, management should be decentralized to the lowest appropriate level. Often the resources to put in place actions for nature, that's the money, people and infrastructure, are directed at that subnational level. At the level of subnational and local authorities, we can put in place single actions that deliver against multiple outcomes. And at subnational and local government levels, we're often at the front line of biodiversity loss, but are also at the front line of behaviour change. And I think that is really important, because a lot of this is about behaviour change. So that's a set of reasons why we're convinced that to really make the transformational changes we need over the next decade, that's working together across all levels of government, this is the only way forward. So at this point, I'll move to our discussion session. We are pretty much halfway through the time that we have. I'd like to initially take questions from state party participants, if at all possible. Then we'll open up the floor to national and local government after that. Please electronically raise your hand when you come into the discussion, and I'll try to bring you in. But when you do come in, please state your name and your organization. I think it would be right to say, John and Sue, that we actually don't always know who is a state representative as opposed to a local government representative. So, you know, we just have to take on trust that those from the state representation sort of come at us first with questions. But I think that will merge eventually into you know, a more open question and answer session. But with the help of the moderators, we'll try to address as many questions as possible. And you know, if you want to put issues into the chat, please do so. There may be a delay in getting some questions via our Japan link, so perhaps we can start the question from the chat. I don't know if is there a question in the chat that you can see, John?
Yeah, I think Singapore would like to take the floor. So,
okay, please Singapore, please step forward. Thank you.
Can I just speak now? I can't find the yeah.
Please do. Yes, we're very welcome.
This is Lena Chan representing Singapore. Thank you very much, you know, Edinburgh, for doing such a great job organizing it. It's been a long journey, but we all enjoyed it. Yeah. What I'd like to say is that the role of subnational governments, cities, and local authorities in the successful implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework cannot be overemphasized. And we're glad that, you know, the Edinburgh Process has helped us given us the opportunity to articulate our views. Now, this inevitably leads to the call to renew and expand the CBD COP Decision 10/22 Plan of Action at COP 15. We need to sing together in harmony with nature in many fronts, including the Edinburgh Process, which is why we also articulated this very same messages at the launch of the 3rd ASEAN Conference on Biodiversity this morning, when Ms. Elizabeth Marima and Mr. Basil Havre also spoke. So what I feel is that we should talk about this in as many fora as possible so that people are aware of this and would join in this call for action for the implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework with the stronger involvement of subnational governments, cities, and local authorities, and everyone. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Chan from Singapore. I couldn't agree more. I think John said that we had something like 400 participants in the Edinburgh Process, which is a lot. But when we think of all the subnational governments and local governments there are around the globe, it's probably quite a small proportion. And the more that we can do to spread that word, the better. So I think we should see this as the start of a story which is going to only expand into the future. So thank you very much indeed. John, can you help me with respect to, are there any other questions?
Yeah, we have another hand raised for Sangitu Epke.
Okay, Sangitu, please.
Thank you very much. Sangitu Epke from Calabar, Cross River State, Nigeria. Yeah, supporting Singapore input is great. Mine is basically on the reporting. Over the years, our national focal point has been able to send in reports that are not properly validated. How do we determine the measurement and implementation of the CBD activities at national, subnational, and local government level? Because you find out that each time the CBD focal point in country in Nigeria returned back, there are no means of stepping down to the 36 states that make up subnational. And it becomes so difficult for us to have input in terms of measuring the activities or action plan. If you look at the target, you could see that we did nothing. But if you look at the MBSA that has been submitted by the country, none has been domesticated at subnational level, and the CBD has not been able to find a way to measure or determine or validate the reports that are being submitted each time to the Secretariat. So how do we go about this? Thank you.
Thank you, Sangeeta. I'm not sure, John, can you advise me about who should turn to perhaps try to respond to that question?
Well, I can maybe start, and then others may be able to step in. I think it's a valid point, and I'm sure the new framework will include a call to update the NBSAPs once the new framework is adopted. And it's something that has come through quite strongly in the consultation. I think Ingrid also mentioned it, that when new NBSAPs are developed, there needs to be a much greater vertical integration so that the subnational and local levels are actually included in national NBSAPs, and that it's a holistic approach that takes account of what's happening at each level. And that's really the first stage of allowing then for better national reporting when you have a more coordinated NBSAP in place. And it's something that in the UK and in Scotland, we'll obviously be looking at updating our NBSAP following the adoption of the new framework, and we'll be considering how we can integrate that better with the local biodiversity action plans that are taken forward by local authorities. I'm not sure, Ingrid, if you want to step in as well.
John, I think you've articulated it well. I mean, maybe just at a more practical level, when we talk about vertical integration, it's not just the mere listing of a local or subnational government. It's also involving them in developing NBSAPs, in the setting of targets, etc. And we understand that this is, this will depend on the constitutional systems and governance systems in each country. But the value of doing that is that you get the buy-in, you get the real picture on the ground, and you then get an additional resource to support you at the national level in achieving the targets, the global targets that are set. And that obviously applies to reporting as well. Thanks.
Thank you, John and Ingrid. I hope that that answers the question. We have a couple of other hands up. Mari Takihara from Japan, would you like to take the floor?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Oh, thank you. My name is Ms. Mari Takihara from the Ministry of the Environment of Japan. On behalf of the Ministry of the Environment, Japan, I would like to make a comment on the outcomes of the Edinburgh process. First of all, I would like to congratulate on the publication of the Edinburgh Declaration for subnational governments, cities, and local authorities on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework through the effort of the Scottish Government and other participants. In the 5th edition of the Global Biodiversity Outlook, it was indicated that none of the 2020 Aichi biodiversity targets have been fully met. According to the GBO5, there was a gap between each country's commitment and required ambition for Aichi targets, and its implementation was also insufficient. This shows that action by CBD parties alone is insufficient. So we recognize that subnational governments, city and other local authorities play specific and important roles in the implementation of the post-2020 GBF to achieve the 2050 vision, living in harmony with nature, shared in Aichi. We expect the subnational governments, cities and other local authorities to work on the transformative changes indicated in the IPBES Global Assessment Report. The COVID-19 crisis we now face has confronted and wanted us to rethink the way we human beings deal with nature. Global cooperation is of course important, but it is time to reconsider the importance of resource management on the local level, and it is necessary to utilize regional resources and strengthen resilience on a local scale. In this context, Japan puts emphasis on landscape approaches on post-2020 GBF. Japan has advocated the Satoyama Initiative with the United Nations University and has advanced it with many partners all over the world. Satoyama Initiative has placed a premium on the roles of communities and enhanced their resilience and sustainability. We would like to further develop the Satoyama Initiative as a bridge between the local community and the international arena for post-2020 GBF. And we welcome the active participation of subnational governments, cities, and other local authorities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mari. That was a very, very helpful statement indeed. I think Lena Chan from Singapore wanted to follow up on the monitoring and reporting issue. I know I have another hand as well. So Lena, do you want to come back on that?
Why don't we give other people a chance, and I'll come back to it when we have the time, because I think to be fair to everybody, we want more participation.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's very generous. Thank you very much indeed. I would point everybody to the chat. I think there's some very useful comments coming through in the chat. So thank you to everybody for contributing to that. I have a hand from Mohsen Mofidi Stanak, and I do apologize if I haven't pronounced that absolutely correctly, but please do step forward, and I think you're from Iran.
Yes. Do you hear me?
Yes, we do. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. Actually, I am the national focal point for Global Taxonomy Initiative in CBD in Iran. Well, at first, I will tell you some short story about the situation here. Since last year, a very all-inclusive crew of scientists and representatives of governmental organizations and also NGOs have gathered as a team leading by doctors and the CBD focal point in Iran. As a result, an inclusive network covering the entire biodiversity stakeholders in my country was drafted. Many experts from universities, research institutes, secondary stakeholders and NGOs were invited to plan the upcoming milestone and also to develop the NBSAP 3. Well, we reviewed the former Iran NBSAPs and the national aims and programs were based on Aichi. Well, none of them were fully achieved as of the entire world. And then we focused on the zero draft of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. The team is now investigating the causes of failures in the previous NBSAP within several specialist groups in 9 Iran CBD national focal points. We are reviewing the NBSAP 2 in a theory of change paradigm to renew the NBSAP 2. Also, we are seeking to discover the barriers that made last decade's failures on CBD in my country. Here is my question. Back to the last decade failures on achieving the Aichi targets, I would like to ask a question and provide an idea. I do believe that the major problem is the implementation of CBD. Compared to other laws, particularly the financial ones, regulatory bodies such as the Court of Audit might be useful, an independent national body in every country to oversee the organizations as a biodiversity court of audit. I think the supervising is not strong enough. So I would like to ask you, the panel and also the other participants whether there is such inspection body in your country that monitors the proper implementation of the National Convention on Biological Diversity in both mobilization and execution. And do you believe that this mechanism works for achieving the targets for 2030 and 2050? Thank you.
Thank you, Mohsen. I'm going to turn initially to John, I think, to respond to that. I mean, I think that if I can just say a little bit from a UK national level, I think, you know, I think first of all, I think it's a fantastic question and a really, really good challenge.
Thank you.
I think at a UK level we aren't quite there, but we're moving in that direction. But John, you can put more meat on those bones. So over to you.
Yeah, I think in every country implementation is definitely a challenge, and the enforcement of regulations for biodiversity. I think mainstreaming is a topic where there needs to be a lot more focus in the upcoming decade, where you have the challenges of competing interests of various sectors and then biodiversity targets. And we know in many cases biodiversity targets tend to come off second best in that discussion. And I think certainly in the UK we will have to have a stronger focus on those mainstreaming elements. I'm not really able to comment for other countries in terms of what procedures they have in place in terms of specific enforcement of the CBD actions, but I don't know if anybody else wants to step in on that point.
Yeah, are there any other anybody else like to comment on the systems that they have? You know, for example, I'm thinking about in the UK we have a Climate Change Act which forces government to do certain things by certain times, and you know, we may well be moving towards something similar for biodiversity in the not too distant future. You know, I think one of the questions I would ask, which I don't think we have an answer to, is to what extent is this, as you said, John, being mainstreamed within the legal and technical structures and bureaucratic structures of countries, and do we have a measure of the progress that is being made to that end? And I think the answer to that is we don't have that measure, but perhaps that's something that over the next decade or so we could not just encourage, but actually measure progress on. And I think that Mohsen has made a very, very strong point there.
I think I think Oliver Hwell from the Secretariat would like to make an intervention on this point.
Oliver, please do step forward.
Thank you so much, Ian and John. My point is on mainstreaming, as I also happen to be the program officer in the Secretariat in charge of supporting the development of the long-term approach on mainstreaming, which will be one of the agenda items of the upcoming subsidiary body of implementation meeting. I can share with all participants that there is already a very strong alignment on the goals of the Edinburgh Process and the declaration in the current version of the document that includes the whole approach that has been developed with an informal advisory group and an extended network that includes representatives of subnational and local governments, notably ICLEI and Regions 4. So I just want to indicate that in as much as the current documents on mainstreaming, and I can extend that to the current documents on capacity building and on resource mobilization are concerned, there are already efforts both by parties and the partners with which we work and ourselves in the Secretariat to make sure there is coherence in this aspect. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much indeed, Oliver. That's really helpful. Is there anybody else would like to come in on this, because I think it's a very important topic.
Okay, if there's no one else, can I please chime in now, or
yes, please.
There's somebody else.
Please do. Yes.
Okay. That they all seem to link up together now. I'll try and be as cohesive as possible. The first thing is that Singapore just launched a new paradigm shift in how we have evolved from a city in a garden, which is a collection of gardens all around, to city in a garden where we open the door and then open up and walk into a garden. But now we've decided that it's so important to welcome back nature, and therefore we have shifted our paradigm to a city in nature, where we are doing, as somebody else had mentioned too, that this is just in line with the UN decade, starting from 2021 to 2030, a decade for ecosystem restoration. So we're doing restoration of our habitats. So then linked on to this, in order to make the city in nature a success, we need to involve everyone, all government agencies, we need to involve businesses, we need to involve every individual who lives in Singapore. Therefore, that's the best way to try and mainstream biodiversity conservation. And the point that was made on how do we actually measure. So we have the Singapore Index on Cities Biodiversity that was developed in 2010, and we have been testing it or applying it for the past 10 years. And we felt that it is so important when we launch the global post-2020 global biodiversity framework. We should already have indicators, maybe not all set, but we must have at least a set of indicators that help us measure our progress on the implementation. And the Singapore Index have several indicators on what proportion of biodiversity you have, nature reserves, protected areas, what have you done about climate change, habitat restoration, connectivity, all the things that we want to measure to ensure that importance, messages, involvement, governance, so ecosystem services. So we feel that if anybody is interested in applying the Singapore Index, please contact me. I'm going to type my email and you can contact me and we can start the conversation going. But I think in the Edinburgh process, plus with ICLEI and with the Japanese, our Japanese friends and several other agencies, we've already started this conversation going. Let's carry on this conversation and involve as many people as possible. Thank you very much for allowing me to speak.
Thank you, Lena. That was really very, very helpful and very generous, actually. And I would really encourage people to take up your invitation to look at the Singapore measurements. I know that we are going through exactly the same questions in the UK about how do you measure biodiversity and how do you measure progress towards good outcomes. And I'm sure that most other countries are having similar discussions. It may be that Singapore is ahead of the game and you've done a lot of thinking about this, and bringing that thinking together to produce something that is kind of internationally robust would be very positive. So I don't know if anybody wants to add to this particular discussion before we move on, but it does seem to be a very rich discussion, actually. It's you know, how do we mainstream and how do we measure? Basically, it's two M's: mainstream and measure, and both seem to be absolutely critical to implementation. I have Ingrid. You wanted to come in, presumably on this subject, so please take the floor.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think I want to just support Lena in terms of that Singapore index. I think it's a really important tool to be able to measure, and the beauty of it is it's designed through a lot of experience with being implemented on the ground to cities. It's very scientist-based. It's very thorough. It's comprehensive. But what I also want to add is that a link to that is another way to measure is to actually engage on platforms such as the Cities of Nature platform and also the Regions of Nature platform, which we are busy developing at the moment, because these platforms allow cities and regional governments to actually show the rest of the world and themselves what they are doing, and to engage and to share and to connect. And we're designing a sort of a dashboard, a commitment platform dashboard on Cities of Nature, which is going to be specifically focused to making commitments to support the objectives and the goals and targets of the new global biodiversity framework. So that's the one thing. I think then your other question around how do we mainstream, you know, I think a lot of it has to do with systems of governance, the approach, and I think the theory of change in the GBF around the whole of government and whole of society is fundamentally important, because it opens up the door for mainstreaming and for vertical integration. But there are different sort of mechanisms that you can use. So one would be policy setting, making. The other one would be planning. And in this respect, I want to just say that at the subnational or landscape level and at the city level, ecosystem level, something like physical and spatial planning or territorial planning or whatever you call it in your country is a very important tool. Yes, we can mainstream by getting the agriculture sector on board and the industry sector on board, but that planning instrument is a way in which you can introduce new requirements and new rules and new guidelines and things. So that's also a very important tool. And then I think something else about mainstreaming that's important, it's about helping people change their way of thinking about things. This is not a new thing, it's just a different way of doing. And it needs to become, as Lena was saying, that paradigm shift towards working with nature, planning with nature, being in nature, being part of nature within our planetary boundaries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ingrid. That's again, tremendously helpful. I see Lena has put up her contact details on the chat, so I would encourage people to get in touch with her. Actually, just turning to the Secretariat, is there any way we can make, if Lena's agreeable, make the Singapore Index available to everybody here just for sake of openness? Is that possible?
Absolutely. We do have the current link to the user's manual, and we can assure everyone on this call that with Lena's support, we will make available the upcoming versions of the revised version. So yes.
That's great. Thank you very much, Oliver. So I have somebody from Ikli in Japan. I don't have a name who would like to take the floor. So please do step forward.
Yeah, it's me, Togo.
Oh, hi, Togo. Hi, sorry, I apologize.
No, thank you. I just wanted to share with everyone that we don't have questions at the Japanese participants at GoToMeeting. So that's sharing information to you. And let me just add on the discussion about mainstreaming. In the climate change sphere, Ministry of Environment Japan have conducted online platform which is kind of like a ministerial meeting between ministries discussing on post-COVID development and also climate change issues. And the Ministry of Japan came out with a concept called response, recovery, and redesign. And on the redesign, it's exactly what Lena mentioned. Lena Chan mentioned. It's a paradigm shift measures, and it's towards redesigning current socio-economic and social cultural systems to be sustainable and resilient. So climate change is talking about the same thing, and biodiversity, we are talking the same thing. So obviously we are faced with similar problems, and there's a space that we could actually discuss these two different very important issues together further for us to come up with some sort of better future for our next generation. So I just want to share that. Thank you.
Yeah, Togo, that's very very helpful actually, and I think the link to climate change is also extremely helpful, because actually, you know, we can't see these as separate issues. They, you know, a lot of them are about the same sort of economic problems and the same sort of behavioral changes that are going to happen. So you're absolutely right. Good. And I have a hand up from Teru Kisuna. I assume from Japan, but I don't know. Teru, would you like to take the floor?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'd like to say about a very important issue I have found among the Edinburgh Process in the thematic webinars. In addition, the Singapore Index, the Urban Nature Index concept was presented by the IUCN in the webinar on the monitoring and the webinar, and many subnational governments got interested in that concept. But at this moment, the IUCN said the indicators have not completed. It is still developing. So I think we should keep multi-stakeholder forum in implementing the global biodiversity framework. So it is the fourth point of the Edinburgh Declaration is calling for. Now, I think this is a good achievement of Edinburgh Process. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Teru. Yes, I think that's a very good point. Can I? We've got about just under half an hour left, and I did at the beginning ask if state party participants could step forward initially, and then we turn to subnational and local government representatives. I think we've had probably a bit of both so far, which is very good. But you know, I wouldn't want anybody to feel as if they are not welcome to speak now. So please do, if you have anything you want to say, put your hand up or put something in the chat. I don't know, John or Sue, do we have anybody that you are aware of that would like to speak?
No, there are no other hands up, and actually we're actually pretty close to our scheduled finish. So.
All right, sorry, I've obviously got that wrong in that case. It was in my diary for 2 hours, so I do apologise. Yeah, so that's a bit of a mess up on my part. So I apologise to everybody. In that case, I think if we've all had our say, then you know, I think it probably it turns to me to wind things up. So so that brings us to the end of this Edinburgh Process webinar for CBD parties. You know, I've said a lot already. I think that there's been some fantastic discussion. So thank you very much, and thank you very much to everybody who's been involved in getting us to this point, including all the people from the CBD Secretariat and from the Scottish Government and from ICLEI, who have done a fantastic job. I hope this has given the parties much to consider in the continued development of the post-2020 framework, and as we move towards COP15, obviously, and that by attending this webinar, this simulates your support for the Edinburgh Process and its outputs. Thank you all to the keynote speakers. I'm sorry that we couldn't bring them to you in this webinar in person, but if you've got the stamina, and I'm afraid I don't because I have other meetings later today, you might want to join the later webinar where many of them will be there in person. That's at 3 p.m. British time, so they'll be there in person at that time. Otherwise, that session, as well as this, will be available to you on YouTube. If you have any inquiries on the Edinburgh Process, please do get in touch with John and Sue at the email address shown here on the slide. If you've enjoyed the webinar and want to spread the word, and we've talked about that already, of the work that that's being done under the Edinburgh Process, please do use the hashtag that again is on the slide here. Finally, if you can find the Edinburgh Declaration on the link shown here, you should be able to find the Edinburgh Declaration on the link shown here. And of course, we want as many people as possible or organisations as possible to sign that Edinburgh Declaration. On behalf of the Edinburgh Process, I hope you've enjoyed the webinar today, and I wish you all to remain happy and healthy at this difficult time. And a personal thanks from me to you all for coming along. John, Sue, do you have any parting remarks?
Just to, if my microphone's working okay, just to thank you, Ian, for chairing this session. I'm sorry about the technical issues on my part, and thank you to you for chairing, thank you to everybody for helping prepare, and thank you to everybody who's participated today. It's been a really stimulating discussion, and we thank you for your time.
I think it's been great. Thank you very much indeed, Sue. So thank you, everybody. Stay well, and we'll see you again soon, hopefully. Bye.
Thank you very much.